Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Room 42. I'm Liz Fraley from Single Sourcing Solutions. I'm your moderator. This is Janice Summers from TC Camp. She's our interviewer. And welcome to Dr. Charles Bazerman, today's guest in Room 42. Charles Bazerman is a distinguished professor in the Department of Education at the University of California, Santa Barbara. As a teacher of writing, he started to wonder what writing was and how we learned to do it. One thing leads to another, and he begins investigating what kind of writing people actually need to do in their lives, what writing accomplishes, what forms of writing have made possible the advance of science, technology, and domains of knowledge. How has writing changed society since its invention? How writers develop over their lifespans, and what happens to them as people as they develop into writers? Such questions lead him to the corners of writing where he gradually comes to see he's living within a larger architecture of our social arrangements and communicative structure. He is still wondering what writing is, how people learn to do it, and what impact it has on people and society. Among his books are Shaping Written Knowledge, the genre and activity of the research article in science, the languages of Edison's light, and a rhetoric of literate action. Today, we'll examine how reading and writing have transformed who we are and who we are becoming as individuals and communities, and how successful living in the contemporary world has come to depend on our skill in writing ourselves into this built symbolic environment, either directly or indirectly. Welcome.
Morning.
Welcome, Dr. Bazerman. I am so delighted to be talking to you today. So, how are we doing so far with our written communication?
Well, we're doing what we need to do to have gotten to this point in our history.
So now when you talk about, because communication is nothing new, but written communication goes back how long?
About 5,000 years, as far as we know. It was invented 3, maybe plus 1 or 2 times, and all the other systems have diffused from from originally the Middle Eastern, Sumerian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican. Some people say Egypt was independent of the Sumerian. I think it at least was peripherally derivative. You know, that they heard.
Right.
They heard over in the neighboring country, they had in the neighboring jurisdiction that they were doing something with these signs, and
so they decided to adopt some.
And maybe make up some of their own, but yeah.
So make up their own symbols to communicate. Now,
yeah, but I really am very hazy about the early history of hieroglyphics. As I think many people are hazy about it.
Right. Now, there's a difference between communication before written communication and written communication. Can you talk a little bit about that? I remember when we were talking one time before, you were explaining like the difference between how oral histories were one thing, but when we decided to write things down, it took on a whole different level, right?
Well, texts tend to stabilize things, although we always read from our new situation, but you have a set of artifacts. So you may have heard about the scholars who a number of years ago looked into oral poetry and the Homeric traditions. Well, it turns out that if you go back to the same, the idea was that it was formulaic enough so that the poets would repeat the stories over time, that they would kind of just reconstruct historically in these easily memorable forms.
Right, and that the story would stay the same?
Yeah, but they don't, because you go back 30 years later and you interview the same griots and this story is substantially different. It evolves. It gets retold every time they tell it.
Well, it's kind of like the fish tale, right?
Where it starts out right. So, but when you have a text, it stabilizes it. So you might have varying interpretations of meanings drawn from it, but the actual symbols, the artifact stays the same. And another thing that starts to happen is that these texts can travel great distances. You don't have to go listen to the same griot again. They travel over, so they travel across distances in time, and you can make multiple copies of it, which we've been getting better and better at making more multiple copies, which then means it can be used to organize larger groups of people who align around the same text. So you get, early on, you get, well, before you get sacred texts, you also seem to get royal texts, and you get legal texts, which then create large jurisdictions. This is all Jack Goody's work. Jack Goody was originally, he's an anthropologist, who was an anthropologist. He came to a lot of public attention around the psychological consequences of writing. But he was an anthropologist first and thinking about society. So there's one book he wrote, which I think is even more interesting than the psychological books, because I'll footnote that in a minute. But it's called the Logic of Writing and the Organization of Society, and which was about the how writing changed the economy, governance, belief systems, law, the major systems. It wasn't an inevitable path, but it created affordances that allowed a variety of uses, which in each of these cases allowed much wider extension of things. The reason I was footnoting before is that people like to accuse, with maybe some merit on the psychological side, of a kind of technological determinism of Goody. Certainly some of his contemporaries were that, like, if you become literate, this is what will happen to you. And but it's he certainly wasn't like that, and especially on the social side, it was more just a set of affordances which could be exploited in a variety of ways, and there's nothing determinative about it. It was just sets of possibilities, and which is, I think, how people have come to see the transformations now that have arisen from literacy.
So, but not what happened societally as we became more literate, right? Because, you know, in the beginning, I mean, you mentioned, you know, the scholarly work and the royal work and then the legal work, all of those things were written. Then gradually, it sounds like society became more and more literate, and that impacted their societal standings, right? Oops, sorry.
Right. I mean, and ultimately, we live in a society which we orient to organizations at a distance, large organizations, written regulations. All these are affordances of writing combined with societal development, organizational developments, various kinds of intellectual innovations. All of these have come to build a world, though, where people like us spend most of our day looking at symbols. And it doesn't mean we're being asocial, but it means that our sociality is carried out, and our organization, our connections, our work is mediated through forms of inscription. Yeah, we're okay. So when you start to, if you're sitting in your chair,
right,
and you're reading a book or you're looking at your computer screen, somebody walks into the room and says hi, you don't hear them. Or, huh? Who's that? Well, no, I'm busy here, right? You're attending not to the here and now, but to the somewhere else. I'm reading a letter from somebody who is in another country, right?
It was written at a different time.
It was written at a different time. And in fact, a lot of the things, sometimes you actually associate it with, oh, this person is in Buenos Aires right now, or this was Buenos Aires a week ago. Or it may be that you're reading something which in a sense it's timeless. It's in a kind of cyber world. It's in a world of symbols and the actual moment of its creation, or the moment that other people may be accessing it become less important. They become invisible, and what's important is the communicative space that's created. And when we moved to a digital world, that became, we had a lot more concrete metaphors for that.
Mm-hmm.
It started to become, when I was young, this was kind of hard to imagine, that this virtual space. But now people talk about the virtual space. And in fact, they want to live in the virtual space. Right.
A metaverse.
Right. We're talking in a Zoom room.
Yes.
Right.
And this Zoom room, in fact, is being recorded and will be viewed at different times by people of different groups, by classes or by other professionals, right? And so it will travel, but they will orient towards it in the here and now, and they will chase away the kids who try to disturb them when they're looking into this virtual space. That context, meaning where you are mentally orienting towards.
Yes.
And actually, we're using our senses. You may be accessing in that with your earphones and your eyes on the screen.
Right.
The future will have more haptics,
or you could be, listening to it on the podcast and walking and taking in scenery at the same time. So your context varies.
Yeah, you can. So obviously, if the asteroid will come down into our room right now, we'd probably pay attention to that. So there's always a mixture, but it's what gets foregrounded, and what's getting foregrounded is also what's activating our neurological system, what we're orienting towards. And so that's been the big change in our lives, that we've oriented towards these virtual spaces, and what gets inscribed in these virtual spaces through which we live our lives, or increasing parts of our lives. And actually the relationship between the virtual spaces and our physical spaces is a very interesting kind of problem. And it's a very significant problem. In a way, it's the problem of how does evidence get into the virtual world? Evidence of the material world get into the virtual world.
How does it?
How does it? Well, that's well, in a certain level, it almost always gets in because asteroids hit, or that things call their attention to us and get inscribed. There was a star seen over the heavens, and somebody writes it down when they're doing, a scripture claims the world is ending tomorrow, and it doesn't end.
Right.
I guess he was a medical doctor, but also philosopher of science, Ludwig Fleck, in the 1930s, say, well, this said that there are active and passive constraints on communication. He was concerned with thought styles and thought collectives. So those were his core concepts.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and in those thought collectives, with their thought styles, which I would also call as largely representational styles,
Okay.
there would be culturally active components. That is the way you would characterize things. That's kind of culturally, I know arbitrary is the wrong word, but culturally variable. So I could say, I'm going to define hardness by what scratches what.
Right.
Okay.
That there's no predetermined reason that should be the criterion for hardness. But once I've done that, nature passively controls which is going to scratch which.
Right.
Whether the coal or the diamond is going to scratch, which one's going to get scratched.
Right.
Right. So that's passive. So there's active and passive, and that's always at play. Right. So I may say the world is going to actively say the world's going to end tomorrow. Passively, it turns out it doesn't end tomorrow.
So you actively say next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, right? Or we can say that we have gotten past COVID,
right?
And then nature comes along with another variant. Then, oops, we haven't.
Not quite yet. Yeah,
we have to tell a different story.
Well,
okay. But he says, but one more thing on this.
Yeah.
What characterizes the world of science is that it's a culture that actively seeks passive constraints. So that means it goes out, collects evidence, and tries to prove or tries to see how nature pushes back. Popper would say disconfirm, right?
Right.
But that there are various procedures for collecting evidence, collecting data, turning experiences into inscriptions, which we then calculate over and argue over in our texts, which then form our picture of what the world is like. So that's why I like the culture of sciences and other forms of evidence-based scholarship. Not that they get the real facts, they have an active cultural style that attempts to inscribe the world, and different fields inscribe it in different ways and sometimes conflicting ways, but still they're at work, and over time one hopes one gets a more complete and accurate picture that allows us to align better with the world we live in. So that's this has something to do with the question we started with, but I've forgotten exactly.
Yeah, no, this is great, because this is great. One of the things I wanted to say is, so this is what is that symbolic reality?
Right.
That's right. Well, if our symbolic reality has that form of active culture, right? Not all social systems, inscriptive systems have that. This is why, again, I'm interested in method and the way, like, students, the more they know about method, the better their research papers are.
Yes.
It's a method. Learning method of your field is part of learning to write in your field.
But and that's true in the practitioner's world too. The more they understand about methods and, the different qualities of different methods and how to apply different methods, it makes their data more empirical, and it creates more accuracy. It creates that push and pull that you were pointing to earlier, right?
Right, exactly. And if they're engineers, the bridges won't fall down, are less likely to fall down, the more they have good methods to find out what's happening and what's likely to happen. Right?
And writing to that symbolic world, that the So the writer who's writing for the engineer, so that they're making sure that they are representing in that cultural symbolic world. Am I getting that? I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
Yeah.
I am.
That's
Yeah.
right. And they seek new methods if they figure, oh, we left out this parameter.
Right.
How can we come to understand this parameter more and inscribe it better so it can enter into our calculations?
Right. Well, and it's also
Right.
like, when we talk about practitioners list too, don't you think it's like how we adopt different architectures, right? And how we adopt different styles like minimalism, right?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think those are the tools that we use to connect. I'm not sure, Dr. Bazerman. What do you?
I'm trying to. I'm not sure exactly what I'm pointing at, but one place you might is that I'm trying to. I can't remember who did this paper. This was years ago, but you all know about the history of neuroscience, right? And then
Right.
there are different ways of representing a neuron, right? And
Right.
over time, the visual graphic representation changed. Each of those methods highlighted something.
Right.
I'm trying to get the details right, but there was some like I'm getting a different example, might be clearer, or I might have more clearly in memory. So when you look at certain late 18th century illustrations of laboratory equipment, they are showing the grain of the wood,
Right.
things that we would not consider particularly important. They become more schematic over time to reflect what we think is important about that equipment, about that produce the results of that experiment, right? So there's our graphic representations reflect our sense of significance, and in this case, significance of the method. What are the actual parts of the experiment that are likely to influence this? So it doesn't matter whether you use this kind of wood or that kind of wood on the machine. It might, if it did, then it would get represented, right? Like wood density somehow would get represented, or grain, if that were relevant.
So that sounds very much
I
like
want to go back.
what you were saying.
We left something out, an important thing out. So, but that not every culture has this as its prime mechanism. Some ask people to look into their emotional experience, right? And that becomes, how are you feeling, becomes the prime form of evidence, or the most persuasive thing in that world. Or what is the word of the gods, that as comes to you in a vision, right? That is what authenticates, and against which you measure. And it doesn't matter what's happening in your day to day, because these truths are eternal and they come from somewhere else, or these are your personal truths. And so there are many other elements that the text could become accountable to, and the community could hold you accountable to.
So in those cases, since we're talking about writing and literacy, are those are then written or verbally communicated?
Well, scriptural
religion
compared.
Like, that's how you know, right? So if we talk about the science world, right, looking for the passive agreement, right? In this other experiential, I don't know how else to say it, feeling world, are you are we comparing to other written religious text and documented communicated things? Am I going down? I feel like I'm going crazy.
I'm going to use two examples.
Okay, good.
One is poetic, right?
Okay.
Does this poem move you? And oh, well, it moves a lot of people. Wow, we're a group of fans of that poet. We find that poet deep and expressing something for ourselves. And maybe if we get to run the literature departments, we can make this work canonical, right? So that's one kind of emotional. But then you have the scriptural text. And so, but then the bottom line is this work really great, or is it great for this group of people and other people really prefer Donald Duck, right? And right. And so what makes for the canon?
Right.
But then there's scriptural religions. Now, some deal with this when they're written down. That's a case where they're written down. You have a lot of early texts are of that sort.
Right.
You can either say the other one's wrong, just dismiss the other. This one is the true word, or you can say that let's do comparative religions. What's true for all of them, and we'll get the essence. Or you could say, and this is where the argument, what was his name? A classic, Eric Havelock did this work. He was a classicist, and he said, well, where did philosophy come? Well, philosophy come from? Well, they started writing down these various stories from these different parts of the Mediterranean world, of Greece and surroundings, and well, this one doesn't match up with that one, and that one doesn't match up with that one. Oh, let's try and harmonize this and find out what's truth within them, and what are the logical principles. And this is where he said philosophy comes from and logic comes from, that it's the consequence of these comparison of what have now become text, what used to be oral stories, but now are transcribed so you can actually look at them. This is the psychological side of Goody, that you can actually look at these texts. Havelock and Goody, I think, they certainly were contemporaries. I don't know whether they knew each other, but they're usually considered in the same breath. So
that connects a lot of things for me, because way back before we were talking about in one of the previous conversations, literacy is still a battle that we fight today. Right. That is still an issue in the world. And yet even people who we might consider not as strongly literate as others are still raised in this literacy bound written communication world. And it's a weird thing to think about.
Right. But so the various sacred texts have great power, even with only a small percentage of the people get to the stage of being given the authority to interpret those texts. It's the preachers or the imams who can interpret them, but nonetheless, you're expected, in most of the traditions, you're expected to know by memory some or all of those texts and be able to repeat it by heart, even if you don't understand the language that you're memorizing. Right? So people live in the penumbra of these texts, as just as people also live in the penumbra of science, and they fight over which penumbra they're going to live in. And one thing I do want to say on this kind of topic is around climate change, where there are very sophisticated methods of inscribing the state of the climate, and the trajectories of those things that impact the climate, and the computer modeling that predict future climate. But there's a very complex intricate system.
Yeah. Right.
And you have to have high faith in these methods and the people who carry them out to believe them. Right. So the people who are most sophisticated in that world, in that inscriptive world, are the ones who are most committed to it.
Right.
Other people say, I only know what I see in front of me. Or I am most concerned, and that may be happening, but I'm concerned with my checkbook and my
here and now. Yeah.
my very much things that are close to my here and now, that inscribe things that I directly feel. Right. Or I actually only know, well, it's snowing outside, right? That's what they know.
Right.
Or they are part of an alternative. And we talked about this the other week. They climate change to them, they're in a world of corporations, of publicly held corporations, where they're accountable to a quarterly balance sheet. Their price and their income is tied to their stock prices, and so people may be predicting climate change, but that's only going to be a small insurance cost for me. And responding to regulation is going to be a big cost. In fact, it might be cheaper to have a large publicity campaign to undermine that science, so we don't have the regulatory costs. Right. I mean, now this gets into real serious ethical issues, but nonetheless, I mean, if you're aware that exists and you still are denying it for temporary profit, that gets pretty evil. But nonetheless, there is a logic. There's a logic to it, and a logic of the corporation, because you could say, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders. How can we even think about 50 years from now if it's going to cost our shareholders money in the short
today?
Today
and over the next 10 to 20 years.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
That's
and I think it comes down to understanding methodology and research methodology and how that's done. And I don't know that that's as common knowledge.
Well, and I think too, it's something you just said.
Important? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Method. Understanding method.
So the scientists who are doing the scientific methodology, and again, it goes back to what you were saying, is the method and how you do things and achieve conclusions and draw analysis, right? That scientific methodologies that a lot of people don't understand scientific methodology, right? So we're talking about a mass of people. So they might not grasp that understanding, but they'll grasp the understanding of denying.
Well, okay. So that again comes up that can lead to distrust if you don't understand the mutability of science, let's say, that the emergence nature of scientific findings, or even actually the way science can go off in the wrong way because it's measuring the wrong thing. Then you might, and the mutability of nature that might underlie it, like so with variance, that's a case. So that people lose trust in that set of methods and the inscriptions that come off of that, and they go to inscriptions they can understand and they trust for different reasons, and they make their calculations in those way because the people, let's say the news hosts of the media that seem to reflect their reality, seem to them to know them. They understand them, and therefore they are more trustworthy, and their news is the real news.
Well, now here's an interesting thing, and it might be off topic, so sorry, but there's an oral history being played out, and there's a written history, and the symbolic reality that they're creating conflicts.
And I think so that I would talk about
when you talk about the newscasters saying something, right? It's not necessarily, or the people saying things, but they don't have the scientific, the written methodology.
Well,
evidence.
they write they are scripted, and and even if they're talking off the cuff, they've gotten the memo, right?
Right.
So it's not like they're
Oh,
telling
that's
folk
true.
tales around the fire. They are also heavily they have a businesses which are just loaded with documents with everything about how do they broadcast, what is their business model. Right. So they are caught up in very, very complex world. It's just not one that's held accountable to to climate science or medical science. Those are different worlds for them. It could be as much as like the Koran versus the Bible. It's a different world.
I like that word accountability. They have different accountability structures, right?
Yeah, that's a key word in my universe, accountability structures.
Yeah.
And they're all wrapped in writing and communication, which is, it doesn't seem like that, but when you look really deep, it really is all wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
That's the story of my 76 years on the planet, is to come to see that more and more. And the fact that we're moving into new technologies doesn't really change it. You just have to think about it as inscription. And I still think that actually letter inscriptions still play a very central role in that, but they're all composed, that we might say. They are composed, transportable, enduring documents. And that's defining our world, and not just the stuff in our eyesight and earshot.
Right.
This is a very complex. Sorry.
It is. It keeps wrapping around back.
Of this. Yeah.
So it's really funny because when you were describing the climate change part, it flipped right back to your discussion of religious text. And there are a few people who are sort of permitted to be the interpreters. And even if you're required to memorize, you might not understand. There are some people who are in charge of the ones who are communicating the message. And really, when you're talking about climate change, those are the scientists, right? They're the ones who have that deep background in order to understand the science and interpret it for the rest of us. It's a very similar pattern and structure, even though it feels very different.
Right. Well, I'm just going to footnote this, but I'm going to pass it by to get that, of course, there are different communicative structures within different communities. So, so that there are some Protestant traditions which are much more lateral. Everybody reads it, and we just talk it through together. And to a certain extent, that is actually built into the scientific community, but you have to be qualified to have a voice in that, and then you have to be evaluated and appreciated to gain more voice and get more cited. Citing is a way of repeating the work of the people. But yes, the basic point is that some in the early period of social studies of knowledge, you might associate with the science wars. I don't know if they heard about those back in like the 80s. We had a bunch of relativist sociologists who were saying, look, these scientists, they just write texts.
Right.
It's not real. It's just smudges on papers. And that was viewed as by other people as, oh my God, no, you're saying science isn't real? And saying science is about reality. Well, I think it's much more complex in between, but they were making the comparison to say, well, it's like a hierarchical religion. And certainly they were making a point that not every decision can be made as a technical one. Right. And that there are all kinds of other social values, political values that enter into our calculation. So it's not, you can't hand over the government just to a bunch of technocrats, which
Right.
some people were arguing, right? So
Ah.
that was, I think, what they were really out after, but they overspoke it.
Right.
So where was I going with this? So yes, but there are some people who are more qualified to carry certain kinds of messages and interpret them for us. So I would rather, and that's why on the TV shows, you have fairly knowledgeable newscasters, but nonetheless who interview the Dr. Fauci's of the world.
Right.
Because they can be much more authoritative. They know more of the literature, and they are more and they can evaluate the methods used by the various participants, and they themselves may have been carrying out that very research and been those theorists that come up with those accounts. So, and I would rather hear people like that, right? People who actually know something.
Yes,
even though they may be wrong, right? Even though they're partial. But I would calculate that into my interpretation of who they are and what they're pitching, right? But nonetheless, I want to hear what they know rather than the third circle outwards from them.
Right, because you're getting it from the source, the research work that they've done, because nobody has the time to go deep in all of these things, right?
You can't. It's impossible.
You can't. It's this is why we love talking to you, Dr. Bazerman, because you go deep into things that we don't have the time or other people don't have the time. So it's important for us to listen and understand, because that influences how we perceive and how we carry forward and how we think about our symbolic universe. And as professional and technical communicators, how we communicate, why we communicate, and what we're communicating is influenced by that. Right?
Right. And
there's one
and
one
that's
question.
my hope. Otherwise, if you left the world to people like me, you get very little done. You actually, right? You actually do the work of making things happen. But I hope that I'm helping you do that with a little more clarity.
Well, it's interesting, because we're talking about the history of 5,000 years and looking back and thinking how all of this stuff did shape the culture and continues to shape the culture, because some of the arguments that were then are now as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, and 5,000 years is not so long ago.
It really isn't.
No,
you remember what Burl Ives lived?
Yes.
Yeah.
I remember Burl Ives.
Milton Berle lived to about 100 years.
Yes.
Right? So what I tell my students is, well, it doesn't make any sense to them anymore because they don't know who Milton Berle is.
No, they have to go Google it. They can Google it.
Yeah, but 50 Milton Berles ago.
Wow.
Right? That's not that long.
Right.
It isn't.
No.
It isn't that long. And the interesting thing, because we're talking about the symbolism and the writing and the literacy and everything else, and the one consistent. And I was thinking about this morning as I was making my coffee, and I knew we were going to come talk to you, is there's one constant, is humans and human nature. Has that changed that much?
Well,
because
the biological humans have not changed that much.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do, humans are very, have a very flexible, in some respects, a very flexible biology, especially particularly our neurological system. And they're learning more and more about how flexible, not just flexible in the course of our lives, but moment by moment, how we reorganize, and we're constantly building and pruning and shaping our neurological systems.
And how important it is that we continue to build and shape and learn and evolve. Like you don't stop.
And and we are, and it's also highly socially responsive. Right. So that means that's we change as our cultures change in some ways. In other ways, not so much, right? And but yeah, so that is character.
doesn't
So
it-
if humans vanish and we are left with the other creatures on this planet,
They'll be fine.
they'll be fine, but they won't have the science. They won't have these changing cultures as much as we do. There are some primate cultures.
Yeah,
There are some dolphin cultures.
right.
But the transmission from generation to generation is fairly small.
Yes.
So
Right.
they're much more stable in who they are and how
Yeah.
they live their lives and what passes through their neural systems.
Right.
Right.
There's that word again,
Cool.
that stable word. And when you
Wow.
first started talking with us, you talked about the importance of the written communication the stabilizing effect of written communication.
But it stabilizes our social groups, but it also allows them to proliferate difference over time because they can be the social groups become more complex.
Yeah.
So the messages get stabilized, but that means you don't start. So every dolphin is a new system,
Right.
right?
Right.
And there's
Yeah.
I'll put it. Every salamander, every roach is a new system,
Uh-huh.
but they live in fairly repetitive worlds,
Right.
and they don't learn a lot over their lifetimes.
Uh-huh.
So the roaches now are very much like roaches many generations ago,
Right.
right?
So
Dolphins,
we've changed a little.
yeah, we have changed. We have changed a lot, and right? We work for corporations. We work for NGOs. We get our psychological, our relationship advice from psychologists. We no longer have local tribal leaders, or they don't have the same effect
Right.
as they do. We live in relationship to global structures and national structures, and we read newspapers. So we live lives very different, much more different than the generations of roaches live. Although their stability might help them, and that's the problem. Humans change so much, and the cultures and societies change so much. It's a grand experiment,
Yes.
and
So
it's an experiment that may fail.
Well, it'll be interesting in another Milton Berle.
That's right.
When they replay this, what they're going to say about our conversation. I got to tell you, Dr. Bazerman, it has just been such a delight talking to you.
Yeah.
I am sorry, but our time is up. We're like over time. I keep getting this message that I need to wrap it up. But it has been an absolute delight talking to you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Always
it's been
fun.
fun for me too.
I'm looking forward to your next book.
The one that's just finishing, which is
That one too.
the writing autobiography. And then there's another one, which I don't know whether I'll get there, but it's the one which sort of covers this kind of big picture in kind of a more popular way than some of the other things. Although I'm going to give a pitch for my book on the languages of Edison's light, which does, I think, speak to your world in a fairly accessible way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well,
thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, everybody. And until next time, take care.
Yeah.
Bye.